Andrew Kennedy. I'm here with Barry Owen and Will Law. We're going to talk about low latency and CMAF. Will it rule live streaming? Before we do that, let's talk to Barry. Let's introduce yourself.
Sure thing. Barry Owen, VP Engineering at Wowza. Been with Wowza about 6.5 years, and that's about it.
Will.
And I'm Will Law. I'm Chief Architect in the Media Division at Akamai. Been there 11 years now. I also chair the Dash Industry Forum, and I'm involved with the CTA Wave project as well on the sidelines.
Cool. So, obviously one of the anticipated new standards, low latency CMAF. Akamai and Wowza have been kind of working on it for quite some time. So let's talk about it. What exactly is it, and why would it be revolutionary for live streaming? Will.
So, we'll just start back about 2 or 3 years, because CMAF's actually an MPEG standard. And it arose out of what I will call a grand deal in the industry between Apple, who was firmly in the TS camp for its media segments, and then the Dash community and the rest of the media community, in fact, who had migrated to ISO-based media file format and fragmented MP4 segments. And Apple basically agreed that if there was a standardized version of fragmented MP4, that they would then start to adopt it across their ecosystem of players. And in return, both Microsoft with PlayReady and Google with Widevine have started to look at CBCS, which is a different encryption mode. And these two things are important because the industry was fractured both around containers and around encryption mode. So both sides are basically seeing a converged roadmap in the future where we will get down to a common container and a common encryption mode eventually. So we're walking down that road now, and CMAF is our first direction down the path.
So how long do you think that path is going to take?
It's multi-year. Everyone says, oh, it's April and CMAF hasn't taken over the world, so something's wrong with it. The reality, it's not a universal panacea for all streaming issues. It's definitely a solid bet on how media is going to look in the future. But even if we solve the problems with common encryption, we still got diversity and codecs that a container is never going to solve. So we're always going to be juggling multiple media objects to deliver, but CMAF at least removes some of the variables we've had around container type and around DRM, hopefully, that have been further increasing the matrix of objects we have to deliver. And that's just the commonality side, and I think we want to talk about the low latency aspect of the CMAF standard today, which is almost it's a subset of it. So I think there's a misnomer right now that CMAF's all about low latency. It isn't. It's about workflow optimization for VOD assets and for non-low latency live streams. But within CMAF is the notion that we can take chunk encoded content, combine it with chunk-based transfer, and establish a low latency delivery solution. And I think that's what's interesting to a lot of encoder vendors, CDN, and player builders today.
Absolutely.
So moving on from that, what use cases do we see and recommend for low latency CMAF? Barry?
For our customers, we see things that, obviously sports, esports, gambling, auctions, anything where that latency of 10, 20, 30 seconds isn't nearly as acceptable as it is for something that they'd like to be real time. The other thing that CMAF-based low latency does is it's very CDN friendly. So it's going to allow you to do that at scale much more cheaply than you could with a WebRTC or even some other proprietary solutions that are session-based.
Okay. So, we talked about the formats, you just touched on there with the CDNs. What are the obstacles for making this kind of adopted widely?
So, a number of options, depending on your format. So another misnomer is that CMAF is somehow an alternative to HLS or Dash. That's not the case. We still have HLS and Dash are our descriptive presentation formats. CMAF is a common container that can be referenced between them. So you have to make sure that your playback device, if you're doing HLS, can support HLS with fragmented MP4 segments, which the Apple devices can, but not a lot of other legacy devices out there. They're expecting TS segments to come with their device. So problem is in device support for playback. There are associated problems with your CDN, because you need to do chunk-based transfer to get the actual low latency. and you have to chain together a series of transfers within the CDN. That's not simple to do, because at the same time as accepting this content, you're archiving it, and you're doing multipath and other solutions, so it gets more complex. And then on the player side, there are a whole lot of complications that introduces too, and I think we're going to get into those later.
So you touched on the CDN complexities, obviously trunk transfer encoding. How many CDNs and what would support that right now? And how is that going to change in the next 12 to 18 months? Obviously, we're looking at low latency. People want it. Is it going to be widely adopted quickly?
Yeah, so I can speak for Akamai. We've been supporting it the last year and a half. I think officially in production we support it this year, but certainly we've been doing demos at trade shows now for a good while. I expect all CDNs to support it over time. As Barry mentioned, the utility of chunk transfer coding is that it requires a 17-year-old HTTP technology, HTTP 1.1 chunk transfer, which is available across every HTTP edge server. So as long as you can chain it together, which I mentioned was the complexity, then you get that huge delivery surface that you get from CDN. And no CDN wants to miss out on that opportunity, so I expect all CDNs to, over time, offer support for it.
Okay. Do we see this, where's the industry going? Is this going to be the standard? We've seen standards before, or attempts at standards before. Is this really going to be where the industry's going? Are we going to hold that?
I think there's use cases for various things, right? There will likely always be a use case for standard HTTP streaming. Longer chunks, higher latency. There's people where that doesn't matter as much. We've talked to customers that says, no, 10 seconds is fine, I'm good. I want massive scale. And I want it cheap. So I think there's always going to be that market. And at the same time, there's always going to be a market for lower latency than we're probably likely to be able to achieve with low-latency CMAF. In the one-to-few or one-to-one cases with WebRTC, it's a great fit there. It works well for that. So there's a segment in between there that I think is very large. But I think there are always going to be places for each one.
Yeah, I think the news media and the press gets obsessed with one format winning the war. Like everything's a war, and it's you either win or you lose. And that, as Barry pointed out, that's not the reality here. We have plenty of use cases that you need different protocols entirely, and you need others that shouldn't be low latency because they don't need to be low latency. Right. So CMAF is just a new development that it really allows us to decouple latency from segment duration. Technically, that's a nice step forward, because we were addressing latency by just making smaller and smaller segments, which has a quality impact. So this is a way to, it's a better way to get lower latency, but it doesn't mean it's the right solution for everybody.
So, big question around all of this would be, when do we think we'd see it on iOS? Do we see Apple doing this? Do we not?
The million-dollar question. Yeah. So as you might imagine, it's hard to get a straight answer out of Apple on things like this. Apple has long supported the CMAF chunk format for standard latency, if you will. We don't know what they're going to support. We don't know what they're going to expect in the manifest. We don't know what they're going to expect as far as how to get the bits from your server to a device. So with any luck, they'll enlighten us around WWDC time this year, and hopefully we won't have to change our minds too much.
Yeah. So the good news is you can take chunked encoded, chunked delivered content, send it to an Apple ecosystem player today, and it will play. It won't break. They can handle multiple moves per segment. It'll just play with higher latency because Apple's AV Foundation likes to be conservative in its rebuffering. The other problem with HLS is even if you have the early availability of data, there's no way in the published standard to describe that. You can only advertise segments for which you've produced the last byte, and as we go to low latency, we want to change that and advertise segments for which we've only produced the first byte, or for in fact we haven't produced any byte yet. And there's an extension to HLS that JW Player are promoting at the moment. Myself and a number of other companies are supporting that. Because I don't see any other converged industry solution. This is LHLS, but it still takes Apple supporting that on their ecosystem to really lift that off the ground. But you'll see HLS.js at the show is supporting the
that's
low
in
latency.
Fact what we're showing in our booth now is LHLS formatted, both in the manifest, and then we tweaked our player to be able to play it. So follows that standard.
And there's a cool duality because you can have an open source -JS player playing with 3 seconds of latency, open source HLS player playing with, and they're coming from the same set of audio and media segments. So that's some of the convergence we spoke about is being
Which is
demonstrated.
a benefit on the encoder
multiple
side. I
boards.
don't have to generate separate chunks for separate formats. So
And we don't have to cache them, and cache contention doubles our cache efficiency if you send us 1 media segment instead of 2 for.
Sure, and that's where
media.
we see a lot of kind of commentary around it's caching it once and then you don't have to double up on everything and go and get everything. So,
but the reality, going back to your problem, what's the reality? You're still going to have TS segments there because not every device supports CMAF yet. So
sure.
it's a theoretical argument that with each passing month becomes truer. The older devices go away with the passage of time, the newer ones become available, and so we transition.
So you touched on it earlier, Akamai already support it. Going forward, obviously that support's going to continue. Where's the kind of development going? Is there going to be additional features, additional getting lower latency? Where is Akamai?
Yeah, there's a lot of work under the covers.
Right.
It's one thing to do a demo and 10 people watch it, whereas 500,000 people come to watch it. What's happening? We do a lot of redundant paths and multipath work under the covers because typically, say you had a 6-second segment before, if it takes you half a second to find it, where is it? There's 6 archivers it might be on, or 3 archivers. Which one has it? But if we're dealing with only a second of latency, I can't spend half a second looking for something. So everything has to be tightened up, all the retry logic, all the path determination. So that's where the engineering goes, and then the QA on top of that.
Sure.
And then also on the analytics side, we want to lift everything up. So we're looking at breadcrumbing when content arrives at ingest, as it moves through our origin services, and as it goes through to the edge server. So a player picking it up can pick up the breadcrumb, and then if we get a latency drop-off, we can isolate the component that's responsible for that.
Makes sense.
And if an encoder wants to send us this too, we'll
There you
happily take it, so we should talk.
And that
does sound very challenging.
And there's some other challenges with low latency CMAF as well. Things like yet to be worked out. So ABR and a solid ABR algorithm and a system for really managing that well. It's difficult with the chunk transfer delivery. So I know Will has some suggestions for that, and people are working on it. But that's going to be probably the next. In my mind, that's one of the next things that needs to happen to make it really widely adopted.
Right, so adding back into all the features that we've seen on previous deliveries into this one, so multi-bit rate is a good example of that.
Yeah, it's available today. Barry's touching on the fact that you can't use traditional methods to estimate your throughput because they depend on timing the download of the segments, and they come faster depending on your throughput. But with chunk transfer, they don't come any faster no matter how much throughput you have because the edge server is giving the data to you as fast as it's receiving from the encoder. So having more bandwidth doesn't help you.
Right.
So there are a number of schemes, machine learning, conservative averaging, side downloads that are deployed today. So there are ABR players out there, although the reality is most low latency schemes today are single bit rate.
For now.
Yeah.
So, kind of closing off here, what's next? We see low latency CMAF. Is there any kind of thing in the next 18 to 24 months that you see coming along to either challenge it or enhance it?
So, yeah, I'm just seeing a gradual rise in deployments. So it's not like a tidal wave's coming in and obliterating a village. The tide is rising.
Right.
It happens very slowly. You stare at it, you come back in a month, more people are using it, encoders are better at it, CDNs are better at it, and deployment numbers rise. So don't expect dramatic changes, but expect latency levels over this year and next year for sporting events and some of the use cases you mentioned to start dropping, and certainly drop below 10 seconds, whereas they're in the 10 to 30 seconds right now for most streams.
Yeah, I think a lot of customers are shooting for, we're seeing conversations around 3 to 5 seconds. I think it's going to be a while before we see that widely adopted, but I think that's where people want to get to.
3 to 5 seconds will be totally achievable. And I think you'll begin to see that at larger and larger scales. I think a tipping point will really be if Apple decides to commit to something or another. So at least you eliminate the fear of, I'm going to do all this work and Apple's just going to throw it away.
Right. Well, we've reached the end of the interview, so thank you very much to Will and to Barry, and we're done. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Cheers.